So this coming week, the material that you're going to be looking at involves the end of chapter 2 and the first part of chapter 3. So the end of chapter 2, the way Maurizio has the book organized, you've got some general stuff about Greek mythology. You have a specific Greek text at the beginning of each chapter. Then there's a piece of scholarship. Then there's a piece of something else from the Mediterranean that can be used as a comparison with the Greek myth in the first part of the chapter. And then there's a final section of what I would call Knock Laban. So Knock Laban, which means afterlife, it's a German word, refers to what happens to stories when they get sort of adopted by later cultures. For example, the figure of Hercules, who has appeared in countless movies, cartoons, and so forth, comic books. That's the same Hercules or Heracles as the Greek myths, but of course things change. Like the Disney Hercules is a typical Disney hero more than he is the Hercules. But Knock Laban, at any rate, is a thing, and the end of each chapter we're going to look at that. And the art discussions that you'll do are also look at Knock Laban. So, to quickly go through some important stuff from this week's reading. So first of all, the scholarship involves a guy named Bronislaw Malinowski. He was a Polish scholar. He was in the Pacific when World War I broke out on the Trobriand Islands. Because of his nationality, the British were leery of letting him sort of go back to Poland because, they couldn't be 100% sure that, maybe he's a spy or something. So that he wasn't basically allowed to leave. And he used that time to study the Trobriand Islanders in some depth. His big contribution, he was not a classical scholar, was the idea of a charter myth. So what is a charter myth? A charter myth is a myth that provides the sort of template for particular behavior. So some examples of a charter myth. In Genesis, after Adam and Eve eat from the fruit of the tree of knowledge, they realize they are naked and they make clothes to hide their nakedness, right? So that's the sort of setup. That would be a charter myth, right? People wear clothes, and people wear clothes for lots of reasons. Right now, it's like freezing outside. If you in fact were to go out without clothes today, while I'm recording this, you would die. I mean, you would die pretty quickly. It's that cold. So there are other reasons for wearing clothes other than, the sense of shame. But what that story does is it ties nakedness with shame, right? Which is sort of a big thing in the whole Western tradition. So that is a charter myth. What is not a charter myth would be something like the story of Demeter and Persephone. Persephone is Demeter's daughter. She gets kidnapped by Hades. Hades makes her his wife. And Demeter, when her daughter is away in the underworld, she grieves. So she's the agricultural deity, and one of the things that myth does is explains the seasons, right? There's a season of things growing, and there's a season of things dying, right? So that's an etiological myth. It explains the causes of something, like proto-science. It's not a charter myth, right? The seasons don't have behavior that we are providing the template for, right? So that's the key thing with charter myth. All right, the comparison in chapter 2, there is in the little summary at the beginning, there's a discussion of how the Babylonian epic Enuma Elish, which just is the first two words of the poem. It means when on high. The Babylonian creation story has a dynastic battle. One god overthrows another, and then a third god overthrows the second god, and that third god becomes the god then from then on. And that's what you have in Hesiod's Theogony, right? You've got Uranus overthrown by Kronos, Kronos overthrown by Zeus. So the Greeks did not live in isolation. They had contact with the Eastern Mediterranean, with Phoenicia. That's where they got the alphabet. They took the Phoenician writing system and developed it into the alphabet. And the Phoenicians, of course, are right next to the Babylonians. Babylonians basically are further inland in Asia. But there would be some contact with those cultures. Those cultures, traders and so forth, would tell stories, and then the Greeks would take some of those stories and say, hey, that sounds like a great story. Why don't we sort of adopt that? And so some of that is definitely going on. Now, the Middle Eastern text that is being used for comparison here is the opening of Genesis. And Genesis from the Bible, the first book of the Bible, does tell the creation story. It does a lot more than that. Genesis is a huge book and covers a lot of ground. But the Adam and Eve story and the creation story is quite different, partly because the Jews are monotheistic. So if you believe in a single God, then that God has to be responsible for the world as we know it and the sense of order as we know it. The Greeks don't have that, right? Gaia is there. Gaia creates a bunch of things. Then there are a series of gods, generations of gods, which end in Zeus. And Zeus provides order as the Greeks know it. But Zeus didn't create humans. There were humans before Zeus was even on the scene, right? So there's a generation of humans under Cronus. And womankind, according to the story, is created by Hephaestus with the help of Athena and maybe with some of the other gods, but not Zeus himself. Now that, of course, in Genesis, where you've got God specifically creating animals, then creating man to be sort of over the animals, and then deciding, hey, man is sort of like alone. We need to create, a community, and then creates woman. There's nothing like that. There's no sense of God sort of feeling, of Zeus feeling necessarily compassion for humans. And since he's not their creator, and since he's also not the creator of the universe, right? There were generations before Zeus is even on the scene. It does give him a certain distance, which I have a feeling partly explains the way the Greeks look at things. Zeus doesn't necessarily feel great about human beings, and so he's not necessarily going to help them. That's different in the Judeo-Christian tradition, where God is the creator, and therefore the way you get right is you get right however you can with God, and he cares, right? There's a sense of him caring. We also have the creator organizing things, which you don't have, right? I mean, Gaia seems to just produce a bunch of kids. There doesn't seem any order. She's just like churning kids out. So there are some things there that you can look at and make comparison. The Knock Laban from chapter 2 features two works. They're both sculptures. One is a sculpture by a man named Paul Manship called Prometheus. The other is by Oscar Lowry called Atlas. Both works are in Rockefeller Center. The Prometheus is right above there's an ice skating rink in Rockefeller Center. And it's at the back of that, of that ice skating rink. The Lowry is a little bit down the ways, but they both came out in the 30s. So they're product of the 1930s in New York. And they represent some of that sense. Prometheus here, if you look at the figure, Prometheus is not presented as just a trickster who tries to trick Zeus, and that messes things up for humans because, right, Zeus gets angry, not only punishes Prometheus, but he also punishes humans, but as the spirit of progress. So keep in mind when this is made. This is made in the Depression. It's made in the early 30s, or maybe in the mid 30s. But the U.S. doesn't fully get out of the Depression until World War II, and during that time, Americans could be despairing, but there is this sense among some Americans that we can pull ourselves out of it. There is a way out of it. And New York, of course, was a symbol with all of its skyscrapers of human progress, right? Nature is beautiful and wonderful and all that stuff, but New York City is a man-made marvel, right? Manhattan is a man-made marvel. This is what humans can do. They can build a New York City. And so Prometheus sort of represents that spirit. Atlas, who is portrayed as a very negative figure, well, we don't get much about him in the Theogony, but he's definitely a bad guy who gets a punishment of holding up the sky. Here, he is not so much a negative figure, but he's a figure of human endurance, right? In the middle of the Depression, humans can, in fact, overcome this. And there is a reason why the leaders of industry, right, the big figures in capitalism in the United States were called titans of industry, right? They're seen as these titanic figures who can do things that are greater than what a normal human could do. So keep that in mind when you look at these two works. They are takes, and they're sort of accurate takes in some ways of Prometheus and Atlas, but not necessarily what Hesiod or some other ancient authors might do with those same figures. All right. The big thing, in a sense, because those are all fairly short, the big thing in this week's reading is the beginning of chapter 3, which looks at Zeus and Hera as gods, and you get some nice information there. But then the literary work that it looks at is a work called the Prometheus Bound. And the reason I have Aeschylus with a question mark after it is Prometheus Bound, first of all, it's a play. It's a tragedy. It would have been performed at a festival in Athens. It would have been performed as a set of 4 plays. And the likelihood is this is either the first or I think the second of 3 plays doing a trilogy. So there's a story arc. I think this is the middle play, so that the first play was The Theft of Fire. The middle play is Prometheus Bound, and then the third play would have been Prometheus Unbound, Prometheus Released. This play as a standalone, it's a great play, but this play as a standalone, and we don't have the others, you're left, it would be like if all we had of Star Wars was Empire Strikes Back. Now, on the one hand, greatest of the Star Wars films, of all the Star Wars films, Empire Strikes Back, in my mind, without a doubt, the best. But it ends with, Han Solo is frozen and God knows where, Luke's lost his hand and is in recovery, and everything's sort of like up in the air. That would be a very peculiar place to leave the story, and that's sort of where we're left at the end of the Prometheus Bound. So it almost certainly is part of a trilogy, 3 plays written together to tell one story arc. And playwrights didn't necessarily do trilogies. They could do 3 separate plays, and then there was a 4th play called the Satyr play, which was like a comic version of mythology. That's what they would produce in a day's work at the festival, right? So there'd be 3 tragedians who would compete, and they would each have 4 plays in competition. So they don't need to be. They do not need to be connected, but they can be. And Aeschylus was known for doing his 3 tragedies as a unit, telling one story arc. And this play is attributed to Aeschylus, but in the 1970s and 80s, there was a big scholarly discussion of this, and there were some scholars who felt that the style of this play is so different from everything else we have that we know that Aeschylus wrote, We have 6 plays, and then we have fragments that they figure this is actually not by Aeschylus. Might be by Aeschylus' son, and therefore could have ended up in a collection of Aeschylus plays. And then by the time anyone knew about it, they were saying it was by Aeschylus. We just don't know. And it could also be by Aeschylus. I side with the people who think this is not by Aeschylus, which is why I generally will say the author of the Prometheus Bound rather than give a name. But it doesn't really matter. We have the play. What we have are 2 scenes from the play. We've got the opening scene of the play, which is pretty impressive. In the opening scene, 2 big thug guys, power and violence, drag Prometheus onto the stage, set him up against a rock or a boulder, and then order Hephaestus, the blacksmith god, to chain Prometheus to the rock. That's the opening, and we've got that in its entirety in the selection. Then they leave, and then Prometheus is all alone on the stage for a while, and then a chorus comes on of the Daughters of Ocean. And then Prometheus basically then speaks to the chorus and talks about himself. And so the second selection is really Prometheus telling his side of the story in the play. So the play does not end with him being freed. He is bound the entire play. And for an actor, this is a really tough role to play because you are, in fact, stuck in the same position for roughly an 80-minute to 90-minute play. And you're on stage the entire time. So it's a tough thing to do. Usually, I've seen one production, usually they try to make it so that the figure can sit down and look uncomfortable, but clearly is not that uncomfortable because it would be tough to maintain that. I mean, after a while, your body starts to hurt, and then you can't really act because you're too busy going, ooh. So, but what ends up happening is Prometheus is presented as a sympathetic figure, and then at the end of the play, it turns out that Prometheus has a secret. He knows that Zeus has a possible threat to his kingdom, that Zeus can be overthrown, and he won't say what it is. Hermes comes onto the stage as Zeus's messenger, and he basically says to Prometheus, look, the big guy wants to know what information you have so he can save himself, and you better cooperate. And Prometheus basically tells Hermes, screw you, buddy. And then Hermes calls on the mountains to then collapse and bury Prometheus. That's where the play ends. So it ends on a really dark note. There are some hints in the play that things will be better. There's a character who comes on who's also in trouble, and Prometheus predicts the future of that character, which will turn out well. So there is a hint of things getting better, which again seems to be pointing to a play that comes after this, presumably the play that we don't have that people call the Prometheus Unbound. So that's all I have time for. That gives you some information, at least from what you have to look at. You also are supposed to do the first art discussion. Please look at the instructions for that so you can do that as well as you can. But I do urge you to jump in and do the art discussion, in this case on the birth of Venus, just because the way you actually learn how to do art discussions is by doing them. So in other words, you do one, maybe you don't do quite so well on that one, but then you'll get some feedback, and then the next one, you can do better. So, putting it off until you're ready means you're going to be crammed trying to do a bunch of stuff at the end, and that's not usually a winning strategy. So I urge you to get it done, get it under your belt, and then it'll be easier to do the ones that come after.